I'm John.
And I'm Meredith.
This is No Talking in the Library, coming to you right before we actually start letting people back into the library, which by the time this is posted will already happen.
So welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, it'll be, interesting time for us all. Definitely glad to have people back around because it's really, a lot more fun being a librarian with people around, for sure. What have you been listening to lately?
Well, John, Vanessa Carlton has released a new album. And as you weren't ever a 13-year-old girl, as far as I'm aware, you probably don't have the same sort of emotional connection to Vanessa Carlton as I do.
Well, that's true. Although definitely I've heard a lot of your music for sure, and I also know a lot of people who were at one point 13-year-old girls, and there's a real overlap between. I mean, that was something that for people at that age at that time, I'm not surprised that it was really struck a chord with you.
Yeah, so her new album is not bad. It's called Love is an Art. It's a little, I haven't been completely following her career past, her first two albums. So I don't know if her new one is a little more, it's almost like metric light. It's definitely has a little more of like an electronic feel to it. And I don't know if that's completely new for her or if it's something that she's been sort of leaning towards. She has like 6 albums and 3 of them I'm not really all that familiar with. The best song is Future Pain. So if you're interested in checking out, new Vanessa Carlton, I highly recommend it. And I do want to just for a minute talk about how much I really do like Vanessa Carlton, and by extension, Michelle Branch and Avril Lavigne, all of who sort of sprung up at this sort of really magical moment at the beginning of the early 2000s. And I know that saying that is so basic white girl to say. I mean, 1,000 Miles has literally become like a pun shorthand for like white girl. But right. There's a reason for it. If it was a bad or mediocre song, it would have just disappeared and faded away into obscurity. But it is that because it is such a good and catchy song.
Right. I mean, there was that was a time, of like really heartfelt, simpler female generated pop songs in a way that was kind of different than, we were talking a little while ago about the Spice Girls, and the Spice Girls were this kind of like big production that had people sort of writing songs and music for them, whereas someone like Avril Lavigne was at least in part writing her own songs. Likewise, Vanessa Carlton was definitely writing her own songs. And that, I think, is a sort of part of that kind of, there's a kind of an authenticity to it. Even Avril Lavigne, who's kind of like produced.
Everything about her is like a complete put on, but she's dang if she doesn't stick to, that made up persona for herself.
Right. I mean, in the event that she actually still exists, right?
Yes, there is, as John referring to, probably my favorite internet urban legend is that the original Avril Lavigne died in like, I don't know, like the mid 2000s. And then they just replaced her with a body double and no one noticed. I mean, the people who are in the know, they know that she's not the same. But really, it's just a matter of the fact that I think that you could argue that in looking at Vanessa Carlton, Michelle Branch, and Avril Lavigne, although I hate to say it because I think Let Go, her second album, is really great. I think she's probably like on the lower end of talent of those three, but I think she's managed to keep herself like current and relevant by like making sort of like big bolder moves. And I think that's what led people to be like, this new Avril Lavigne album is not like her, you know, old stuff, so she must be a stand-in.
Right. I mean, if you ever want to go down the rabbit hole, people watching this, like, just start looking up Avril Lavigne body double or whatever, and you'll find people have put an incredible amount of time into proving that the person purporting to be Avril Lavigne now is not the person who was Avril Lavigne at the time of Let Go. Well, you know, I've been trying to check out new music just because I've had some time on my hands, and I discovered this band called the Bomb Pops. They're sort of a punk rock band, or kind of a melodic, like, back in the day we might have called it a kind of escape rock band. But they're from San Diego. They've been around since 2007. They put out their first couple of records independently, and then their last two, they just put one out, which is called Death in Venice Beach, and it's on Fat Records, which, if you know about sort of the sort of fast music scene, is the sort of center point for music of a kind of melodic, whatever. It's the two sort of main guitarists and singers are women, and it's really. I love it for a lot of reasons. They really write great melodies. It's fast, it's really pacey music, but they have good melodies, and they have lyrics that are kind of very heartfelt and very sort of telling you about themselves in a way that I think is kind of interesting. And you know, one of the great problems of underground music is that it's too many boys. I mean, I say I say this as somebody who is one, and who's. But it's kind of nice to hear when you hear sort of like women writing about their perspectives, not because their perspectives are necessarily like vastly different than the men's are, but just to hear them sort of say it makes them part of the conversation, and sort of brings in issues like the way they relate to relationships, or the way they relate to their problems in their lives. It's just important to hear that voice, which I think is also, you know, just to show that they can, you know, sometimes a lot of, you know, people be like, well, this band has a woman singer, but like the sort of skill positions or whatever are not women. But this is both women playing guitar and singing at the same time, which I can tell you, having played guitar for a long time, I can't do. But I think it's a really the new record, Death in Venice Beach, is a little sort of less hard rocking than some of their earlier stuff, but still very punchy, and like lots of cool melodies, and you know, really energetic and just really fun music.
Yeah, what you said about showing that like girls and women can like be leads and be part of bands is probably why I gravitated so hard and so quickly to, you know, the three musicians that I've been talking about. Because at the time, and I've talked about this on our website, and I think on here, I was listening to a lot of Nickel Creek and a little more country music, probably when I was in middle school. The Dixie Chicks were really big at that time. But when I was about 13, 14, there really wasn't, you know, young women like singers or performers like what came out when the Spirit, I think the Spirit Room was the first one, Michelle Branch's first album came out in 2001. And it just, I felt like it changed everything. And I know that they became really mainstream, and I know that a lot of people are in my position when they say like it felt like, for me, there are musicians who are making music for, you know, people my age and, you know, people like me. And also just, I wanted to emulate Michelle Branch's style so badly. She had such like the cool casual girl next door, but also like is cool and a little alternative. And I mean, I'm wearing jeans, t-shirt, and Chucks right now, and probably because it's the way that she dressed when I was really into her when I was 14.
Yeah, that's, you know, the music, I think that that really stays with you is the music that you can kind of see yourself in, or that sort of like bonds with something that you're really about. And it's really, I mean, okay, let's just, by the way, you know, you were mentioning the Dixie Chicks, and there's a lot of history of rock or popular music where people have other people writing songs for them. The great thing about the Dixie Chicks was, number one, they were writing all their own music. Number two, they're all phenomenal musicians. I mean, especially I think Marty McGuire is the one who was like a prize-winning fiddle player. So they're really, you know, top-end quality musicians. And I think that was a sort of a good, that gave the Dixie Chicks a kind of cachet that they might not otherwise have had. Vanessa Carlton clearly is also just an absolutely virtuoso quality musician. And
yeah, not only is she like a phenomenal musician, I think she's like a trained ballerina or something also, like.
Right, she's just a very artistically talented human being, and she writes, you know, your thing about 1,000 Miles is exactly right. Like, it wouldn't have that kind of traction if it wasn't a good song. And, you know, I think that's all that needs to be said about it in a certain sense.
Okay, quiz time, not quiz, question time. So you kind of came up in the Pacific Northwest music scene, right? Like you were there for a lot of, you know, that stuff. If you could go back though, is there a type of music or a movement that you would have liked to sort of been on the forefront of, like to experience?
Well, interestingly, I lived in Walla Walla, Washington, and then I lived in Portland where I went to college. And this was at the time that sort of grunge thing was getting going in Seattle. And Portland made some sort of contributions a little later on, but mostly kind of different. Portland bands tended to be kind of emo bands or sort of harder rocking bands. I mean, like Hazel or 30-06 or bands like that. But I knew so many people who, I can remember actually somebody coming in with, I had been talking to a friend of mine who said, you know, I was in college and was like, what do you think the next big thing is? And right at that point, somebody pulled out a copy of Screaming Life, the first Soundgarden 12-inch. And I remember thinking, I think it's probably going to be that. And if I could have been sort of a little closer to seeing some of those really early Soundgarden shows, I mean, I saw a lot of those bands because, of course, they came down to Portland all the time after a certain point. So that, you know, I was helping a high school kid in here one time who was doing a report on Nirvana, and I was mentioning to him as I was like digging these books out for him, like, oh yeah, I saw them on New Year's Eve, 1990 something. I wouldn't even say when, but at this tiny club in Portland, when somebody stole their bass players. He had taken off his conchucks for some reason, and somebody stole them. And so at a certain point, it's, you know, they're like, we're not going to play one single song until somebody gives my shoes back. And then it's getting close to midnight, and they've like got to play because that's what they're there to do. And they start, you can tell they're really annoyed. And then about 3 songs in, like this pair of chucks with the laces tied together comes flying out of the audience. But that was, you know, it's funny how big grunge got because it at the time it just seemed like, you know, a bunch of people playing sort of, you know, garage rock, and it just didn't seem like, it was weird. Once I moved to Seattle, you know, my wife had actually lived up in Seattle at the time, She was like, "Oh yeah, that pizza joint. Like they all used to hang out at that one place." Or like, Seattle's kind of a small place too. But yeah. So, but you were mentioning to me that when you were 13, 14 years old, like this music was really just central to like the way you were with the
Oh,
world.
absolutely, because it was cool. Well, maybe it wasn't cool, but it was socially acceptable. And as we were talking, my friends didn't understand Nickel Creek. They didn't really. They made fun of it. They called it banjo music, and then would hum the Deliverance theme song. But like this was music that I could, and I wasn't really into, 50 Cent was really big, at the time, and a lot of that sort of like rap and hip hop. And, this music was something I really, really enjoyed, and was also, socially acceptable because a lot of people liked it. A lot of people wore like the Avril Lavigne necktie to school. I could listen to Michelle Branch and nobody would say anything. So it was a
Right.
way for me to like, feel like I was kind of listening to cool music, but, sort of, people making music, not just studio produced or whatever, while also not getting made fun of in high school.
Right. Well, I mean, it's once again, it's funny to me, like when you were mentioning the sort of mainstream and how that kind of gelled a little for you. But I remember I was going to graduate school in New York at one point. I was living in this dorm that had a kind of TV lounge in it. This was before everyone could just stream TV wherever they were. And there was one kid who was in there constantly, and he was like really fascinated with Pearl Jam. And then he found out that I was from like Pacific Northwest. I certainly didn't tell him, but he found out, and he was like pumping me for information. And he thought it was like totally crazy that I'd seen all these bands. I mean, you just couldn't, if you were hanging around in Portland, you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting a grunge band pretty soon. And I remember having this conversation with him where he was going on and on and on. He was watching some MTV thing, like celebrity basketball thing, where like all the guys in Pearl Jam were there. And I was like, dude, I saw those guys when they were called Mookie Blaylock, and I have to admit that I wasn't all that impressed. But, it really was a sort of thing where people kind of, once a kind of sound got discovered, then people sort of, like all kinds of bands out of that scene. I mean, it's funny that Nirvana became the biggest one because they were like stylistically a lot different.
And to answer my own question, if I could be part of a music scene, it would have to be Riot Girl, which I was unfortunately too young to have been a part of or even know anything about, especially growing up in central Pennsylvania. There was no Riot Girl happening, but just for the fact, like, I've listened to some of the music now, Bratmobile and what's the other one? Team Dress.
Bikini Kill, Team Dresch.
Yeah, Dresch. And the music's okay. It's a little almost leaning a little too much toward noise, but I also, but the Riot Girl, it was more than just the music. There was also the whole culture of like making zines and stuff like that.
Right.
I read a couple of books about it, and it's like predated Tumblr. I think like that's
Right.
sort of what it kind of morphed into. But I just love the idea of, women sort of making their own like culture and communication and music and all of that. So
yeah, Team Dresch I was aware of very early because my friend Jody was in that band, and she's like this incredibly creative person and just a sort of a person who's like very driven to sort of create like art that expresses what she's about. But I can remember like I saw, I think it was the Nation of Ulysses show. Nation of Ulysses is a band from DC, and they came and played in Portland, and they played with Bikini Kill, who I'd never heard of up until that point. I guess I might have heard the name. And Bikini Kill, like, I will concede, like, musically, not necessarily my favorite music, but I can remember seeing them and just being like, oh my gosh, they're totally intense. And I'm really glad that this music exists, because if I was, it wasn't really meant for me. in a certain very important sense, which is not to say that it was any less good, but for the people that it was meant for, in a certain sense, like it must have been super empowering just to see Kathleen Ann up there just being like, you know, this is what I'm about. If you don't like it, I don't care. You know, I'm just going to make the art that I want to make, and that you know, empowers me and people like me. And I think that that's really powerful.
So the bottom line for those of you watching is you should all listen to Michelle Branch's first two albums, Spirit Room and Hotel Paper, and I do not think that you will be disappointed.
Yeah,
That's my takeaway for today.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent takeaway.
Anything else you got?
Well, I just want to mention, sort of before we go out, I've been one thing, since we're talking about things that influenced us growing up. I was a skateboarder, as practically everyone I knew back in the day was, and I saw for the first time, I think I saw it last year, and then I watched it again recently. There's a documentary out about the Bones Brigade, which was the Powell Peralta skateboarding team that had back in the day the absolute greatest, the really path-breaking skateboarders, Tony Hawk and what's his name, Jeff Guerrero and Lance Mountain and Rod Mullen. And Rod Mullen is this really fascinating character. Now you may be like thinking, like, why do I care about skateboarding? And you know, maybe you don't, and that's fine. But if you watch, like, Rodney Mullen is a really interesting story because he's this kid from Florida. He grew up sort of on a farm. His father like really discouraged him from skateboarding, and he developed basically all of the tricks that. So there's two kinds of skateboarding. There's ramp, or what they call vert, and there's street, which kind of grew out of freestyle. And in the latter kind, pretty much every trick that they do was developed by Rodney Mullen. Like he, just to give you an example, so there's a guy named Alan Gelfand, and he invented a trick that was called the ollie. The ollie is like pushing down on the back of your board to get it to sort of go up in the air, and skaters who were doing bowl skating or ramp skating would do that. As a matter of fact, and it became his nickname, Ollie Gelfand. Rod Mullen figured out how to do that without being on a ramp. Like he invented what's called the flatland ollie, which involves like stamping on the tail of your board so hard that it kind of bounces off the ground, and you go. And he could go like several feet in the air doing that. I mean, it's really, and it's kind of, so what's interesting about this is, I mean, these people are really fabulously talented athletes, but Rodney Mullen is like an even more. I mean, it's a kind of a beautiful story because he's this guy, he's very odd. He's like probably on the autism spectrum, but he's very intense, very intelligent, and a guy who was so dedicated to this craft that he basically developed an art form. If you watch these videos, the Bones Brigade biography is on Netflix, I'm pretty sure, but it's also, you can just find it on YouTube. There's also another documentary called Rodney Mullen from the Ground Up. And it's a really interesting human story to hear about, you know, these guys who are really just kids building a sort of an art form that's meaningful to all of them. So like new tricks would happen, and the community was such that they'd all find out about it pretty fast, and they'd all be like, okay, if I'm going to remain competitive with these other people, I have to then learn how to do this. And it's a sort of an interesting look into, I mean, I sort of knew about it as it was happening because I rode a skateboard and I read Thrasher, and I crashed a lot. And it's, you know, I think people a lot of times underestimate what kind of, you know, how difficult it is. Like when you're skating a ramp and you go up over the top of the ramp, there's a point, especially if you're spinning, when you can't see the ground and you really don't know for sure, you know, like you have to sort of like, oh, okay, there's the ground. Now I have to, now it's coming quickly. But it's like the ability to generate these tricks and to do these new things is a really it's a way of kind of people pursuing excellence in a way that I think is actually, if you get over the fact that you think skateboarding is silly, is actually a really interesting, bit of human life.
That sounds cool. My knowledge of skateboarding begins and ends with Tony Hawk Pro Skater for PlayStation.
Right, which they are re-releasing.
Yes.
In October.
I will definitely be checking that out.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, is that's all we've got?
Yeah, I think that does it for today.
All right, well, we'll see everybody again next week, and we'll be seeing you in the library. By the time this airs, you'll all have been here probably, so can't wait.
Yep, see you all later.
All right.